Welcome to episode 73 of the Eat for Endurance podcast. My name is Claire Shorenstein, and I'm a board-certified sports dietitian and runner based in Santa Cruz, California. I provide virtual nutrition services to teenage and adult athletes of all abilities, and I host this podcast to demonstrate that there is no one-size-fits-all nutrition approach towards optimal health and performance. Today, my guest is Heidi Strickler, a sports dietitian, trail runner, and self-proclaimed outdoor junkie based in Seattle. I got a listener request to do a show on relative energy deficiency in sport, also known as REDS or RED-S, around the same time that I heard Heidi on the Trail Society podcast, and I knew that she'd be a great dietitian to tackle this topic with me. I have covered this topic before, but it's been over 2 years, so it was time to revisit and do another deep dive. We covered the basics of REDS, including warning signs. We talk about the normalization of disordered eating, especially among athletes, intentional versus unintentional underfueling, practical advice on how to make sure you're eating enough and not just relying on hunger cues, losing your period and what treatment may look like to get it back, and so much more. I hope you enjoy this episode and find it helpful. So without further ado, here is my discussion all about REDS with fellow sports RD, Heidi Strickler. Heidi, welcome to the Eat for Endurance podcast. How's everything going today?
Going really well. Yeah, I can't complain. I'm enjoying a nice summer day in Utah, so it's a lot hotter than where I usually am in Seattle, but yeah, doing well.
Yeah, awesome. So before we dig into today's sports nutrition topic, can you share a little bit about your background, both as a dietitian and as an athlete?
Yes, yeah. They're very much blended. I guess there's a lot of overlaps, kind of a little bit of a Venn diagram. Ultimately, I got into nutrition as an athlete. You know, I had never really thought about food or nutrition when I was growing up, when I was in high school. I mean, I always loved food. I was a good eater, but didn't really take any interest in it. And didn't actually even plan to study it. From the time I was really young, I always knew I wanted to have a career where I was working with athletes in some aspect. But, you know, I didn't necessarily know exactly what that looked like. I had thought about like physical therapy and orthopedic, like surgery and things like that. And, you know, after taking kind of a year of classes my freshman year, my advisor, you know, recommended that I look into nutrition. The university that I went to had an option of a sports nutrition specific major as well. And so I took my first class, which was food science, and I was totally sold. I'm a big science nerd, so I was just like fascinated. And I think one of the reasons I was interested in it is I went to college on a soccer scholarship. Soccer was actually my primary sport growing up. I started playing when I was 3, and it really kind of was eat, breathe, sleep soccer. And so it was super, super competitive, but never again, no coaches never talked about nutrition. It just was not talked about at all. And then when I went to college, our athletic trainer gave us like a little nutrition 101. And I don't know, I just kind of started realizing, how the impact that nutrition could potentially have on performance, and kind of took it from there. And I ended up graduating with a triple degree in dietetics and nutrition, sports and exercise science. And, you know, was always still, you know, fascinated with just the human body and anatomy and physiology, and still am. And partway through my collegiate soccer career, I actually switched to track and cross country. I had also never run in my life, but I was always the weird kid on the team who liked the fitness component of soccer. And so I ended up switching just due to soccer wasn't a great fit for me, unfortunately, at the university that I went to, and totally fell in love with running. And I grew up in the mountains in Utah. And so pretty quickly after college, transitioned to trail and ultra running. And over the course of my, you know, dietetics career, as well as my athletic career, I've oftentimes focused my expertise professionally on my experiences personally. And so, you know, sports nutrition was always a really big focus of mine. I always knew ultimately that wanted to be my goal. And so over the course of my career, I've been a dietitian for 9 years now, 9.5 years. And I've kind of honed my expertise more and more and more. And so endurance athletes is kind of one of the areas that I focus on as a dietitian. Endurance athletes and mountain athletes. I said trail and ultra running is still my kind of truest love. If I could do it every day, I would be happy. But I also just love being active in the mountains. So backcountry skiing and skiing. I bike. I've biked, raced a little bit. I've raced triathlon a little bit. I love mountain biking and gravel riding. I like climbing. I like open water swimming, camping, backpacking. Just being active outdoors. So I do focus on like the mountain athlete and the endurance athlete. I also focus on female-bodied athletes and do a lot of work with nutrition in the menstrual cycle and how the menstrual cycle can impact our nutrition needs and vice versa. I specialize in plant-based athletes, and while I'm not plant-based and now, I did spend a lot of my kind of competitive running career being some variation of plant-based. And then I also specialize in athletes with eating disorders or relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS, primarily because when I was in college, I started to develop some disordered eating, mostly through sport, unfortunately. My dietetics education also didn't help that. I learned a lot of unhelpful things. And over the course of, my early 20s, mid-20s, it really it ebbed and flowed a bit, but ultimately became a full-blown eating disorder in my late 20s, and I ended up going to eating disorder treatment. And so now I really focus a lot of my career on speaking to young athletes, high schoolers and college athletes, coaches and parents, and even like doctors, and just doing a lot of education around just like, I think giving some awareness to all the things that can be encompassed in those early stages. And I think there's so many things that are normalized especially in the world of sport when it comes to disordered eating patterns and body stuff, and even things like an athlete losing their period during the season. These things are very normalized, but shouldn't be happening. And so I think being able to talk some truth to that and just give young athletes the information I really needed to hear at their age, and didn't. And then, kind of provide that education to coaches and parents too, because I think there's a huge amount of influence that coaches and parents have on young athletes. And so being able to help them understand how they can be supportive or not supportive of their young athletes. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. And I actually have to say that's probably one of the best full-on descriptive, like when I asked that question when I get my RD guests on, and that was a really great response. I like that. And it makes me want to ask like 1,000 questions. That's the only problem. Our topic, of course, today is relative energy deficiency in sport, RED-S, and we're also going to go into the menstrual cycle nutrition. Mm-hmm. But I almost want to just like put a pin in that for 1 second and ask a few follow-up questions on your background.
For sure.
For one, as a dietitian, we're kind of like, I've been a dietitian for about 9 years. I was never a soccer player. I mean, we have very different backgrounds in some ways, but there is a lot of, there are so many themes I see in dietitians, especially sports dietitians. I'm curious what you think about how many dietitians have had some form of eating disorder or disordered eating. And that's like, and especially as an athlete, I know I've had eating disorder in the past, and I've shared that on this show before. I feel like it's such a part of so many people's stories, you know, which I guess isn't surprising. You think about therapists that go into therapy that themselves needed therapy or whatever, right? Like it's part of why we're passionate about what we do. But it's just something that's always kind of struck me. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And also the fact that it's just disordered eating is such a normalized part of things. And I don't know if you listened to the recent Trail Society podcast with Amelia Boone, but So there was part of that discussion is like, hey, what is normal and what isn't normal, and her finally seeking treatment. So just a few things that are on my mind. I know this is a little tangential, but I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think, a couple different components. It's, that you do see loads of dietitians, working in the space, sports nutrition or not, with eating disorders. And I was on actually another podcast a few months ago at this point with a couple of dietitians. We were all having the same discussion of we all had eating disorders. And it's kind of the chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
Just different where, for me, as much as I can remember, while I do remember like being aware of calories and restricting a little bit before I decided to change my major, I don't ever remember choosing to study nutrition so I could be better at restricting. Like I don't remember that being part of my process. It was more like the dietitian education plus a million other things led to my eating disorder. Whereas some other dietitians that I know actually pursued a dietetic education in order to be able to do their eating disorder better.
Oh, interesting.
It's such a gross way to put it.
Yes.
But it is so, especially I think in the era that we, when we were getting educated, it was all about just
weight loss.
Like weight loss. It's
Yes.
so gross.
Yeah, I know.
And so yeah, I think it is fascinating. I also, it wasn't until after I, went through my own, like, kind of really hit rock bottom with my eating disorder, went to treatment, and then made it public, that I did decide to really change my focus and focus on that as focus on athletes, because I think there is a lot of power in any helping profession to feel like your clients or patients or whatever you call them, like, feel seen. And I think there's a lot of power in being able to tell my like high schoolers and college kids, like, hey, I've been there. Like, I've been in your shoes. I know what you're going through. Obviously, everybody's experience of their eating disorder is different, but I also do, and I don't know what your experience was, but just on the normalization component, it was actually for me, like the pressure I felt as a dietitian to eat perfectly and like walk the talk, especially in like the space and time that I was working in, is part of what fueled my eating disorder. Like, I felt like I, had to, people would all, the comments that people make when they hear your dietitian, like, oh, don't look at what I'm eating, or, oh, I don't normally eat like this, or, oh, your dietitian, you must, love kale salads and eat just chicken breasts. Like,
you won't want this brownie that I made. I'm like, yes, I do.
Yes,
give me
I
the
do,
brownie.
Actually, yeah.
Give me too.
Yes, yeah, please. So I had a lot of shame about being a dietitian with the eating disorder, and that's also why it took me so long to get treatment and kind of come out about my eating disorder, because I thought it was going to ruin my career, but it was a really important part of my healing process, and it was honestly like the best thing that I could have done for my career. I think because of what I said, where like it, I think people work with me because of that, not in spite of it, I guess. But it is very interesting, just the normalization and just all of that like diet culture BS.
And I had a very different experience in that my eating disorder was a lot earlier in life. Like started in high school, and it was in college, and kind of I was a career changer. I didn't go back to school to be a dietitian until I was 30. Okay. So I started late, but so it was kind of already in the rear view mirror, I guess. And it was really fueled largely by getting into distance running, because I also got into that much later, and my interest in sports nutrition and all of that. But the disordered eating part definitely lingered, that more normalized form of disordered eating. That is kind of like, oh, well, I'm an athlete and I'm a dietitian and all of that. And I do remember being, just in schooling to become a dietitian. And I look back, I'm like, whoa, there were some behaviors there. Or even like I actually just posted about this the other day. I was like, holy crap, I can't believe how little I feel, like how I would like go into fueling a marathon or whatever, just being like, barely, I didn't really understand. And they don't teach you sports nutrition early on, so I didn't really get it. And so I would basically take nothing. And, how little can I get away with taking, rather than like, let's see how much I can train my gut to take, which is like where we're at now. But it is very interesting just seeing the shift. But anyways, we digress. But this is all related because we are talking about. I know. Oh my god! This is my downfall with talking to other RDs, and I've said this before, but I love having dietitians on the show, because not only is this is literally how I network, because I work by myself. I'm like a virtual solo practitioner. This is how I connect to people, how I meet other dietitians, how I support other dietitians. I love it. We talk about fun things. It's great. But then we kind of get on these digressions. We do. So anywho, for the listeners, let's get on topic. It is all about Red S. We're going to talk about menstrual cycle nutrition. And I did do this topic before, but it was ages ago. So I want to revisit it. And I know this is one of the things you're particularly passionate about. So I think by now, most people have heard about Red S, but just for anyone who may not be familiar, can you just explain briefly what Red S is?
Yeah, so REDS stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, which is why we call it REDS, because otherwise it's a mouthful.
Is it REDS or Red S? I just realized I've been saying Red S. Is it REDS? Is that what you're supposed to say?
Well, so So I just attended the Female Athlete Conference
and they
in
said reds?
Boston in 2023. And there's an update coming on reds, and they decided to remove the hyphen and just call it reds.
Okay.
To like streamline, even some like, hashtags. Like you can't do hashtag red-esque. So
sorry to interrupt, but that was like, I was like,
no,
oh God,
totally
am I
fine.
saying it wrong?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Thanks.
So previously could have been red-esque.
Yes.
Going forward as of October 2023, it will be reds.
Reds. Got it.
So reds. So reds stands for relative energy deficiency in sport. And initially the term was like coined in 2014. And it was kind of an expansion on what used to be called the female athlete triad. And essentially the female athlete triad was this like syndrome or like trifecta of symptoms that involve like menstrual dysfunction as one corner of the triad, bone health or low bone density, bone stress injuries, etc., as the other corner of the triad, and then just low energy availability, or essentially a mismatch between calories in and calories out. And so the female athlete triad existed for a long time, but over time we realized that this syndrome, essentially when an athlete is not taking enough calories to meet their exercise energy expenditure plus their energy needs from the rest of the day, that syndrome, that experience of LEA or low energy availability happens to all genders, not just females, and affects so many systems of the body besides just menstrual function and bone health. And so we came up with this term REDS, which now is presented as more of a wheel versus a triangle. And essentially this kind of cascade or like milieu of body systems that are affected include our endocrine system, our metabolic system, our hematological system, or essentially like our blood health, our growth and development, our psychological development, things like depression, anxiety, OCD, moodiness, our cardiovascular system. You're going to see things like lightheadedness, low resting heart rate, dizziness, our GI function, our immune function, our menstrual function, and our bone health. And how these body systems are affected and in what order is pretty dependent on the person and, many, many times. But really kind of the etiology or like what happens is when a body is undernourished, when they're in this low energy state, it essentially creates stress in the body. And when a body is stressed chronically, it's going to produce cortisol, which is the body's stress hormone. And part of the problem is when stress hormone or cortisol is being produced at high levels, it doesn't have the building blocks for the other hormones in our body, things that have to do with menstrual function and bone building and growth and development. And then our metabolism slows down. If my body's not being given the nutrients it needs, it intelligently is going to say, I'm going to slow down the rate that I'm using energy to preserve and conserve. And so it's with that metabolic slowdown that you really see that cascade of effects happening, where you see, an inability of bone to rebuild, or nutrients are being leached from the bone. You see the heart rate slow because again, the body's trying to conserve energy, and the heart is getting weaker as, again, nutrients are being pulled from the heart. People will get cold more often. That's why things like immune function and injury risk goes up, 9 to 14 times. Our GI function slows down because everything else is slowing down, and so our like motility and digestion will slow as well. So it does kind of become this like cascade of effects, and they're all pretty interconnected. But I think, like I said, it can be really challenging because all those different symptoms, there isn't like a specific order where it's like, oh, you'll see this one first and this one second. And so it's not this automatic, oh, if I look for this symptom, I know I'm dabbling in reds. And the other problem is, again, like a lot of the symptoms that are part of some of those early warning signs of reds are also, again, really normalized experiences, especially in endurance sport. So things like iron deficiency, a low resting heart rate, GI issues, and just like overall like getting sick and injured. Or even like losing a period, there have been a couple surveys put out there, and up to like 50% of athletes, like female-bodied athletes, think it's normal to lose their cycle in like a high, like either in competition season or in high training season. and that shouldn't be happening. So there's just a lot of normalization, which also ends up in a lot of these symptoms being kind of brushed under the rug. So
it's kind of crazy to me that that's still thought as normal. Like I feel like there's so much talk about how losing your period is not normal, and people are more aware of that. And it's like shocking to me when I still hear that. You know what I mean? That's bonkers.
Yeah. And I know for me, when I was in collegiate sport, it was a badge of honor to, like, when I lost my period, it meant that I was fit and I was training hard enough. And there still is, while we've come really, really far, when I present to groups of, high school athletes or collegiate athletes, or, put out surveys or whatever, we have come so far since I was in college 10 years ago in terms of awareness of periods and talking about them, etc. But we still have so far to go. There's still so much toxic language and messaging and just confusion about those topics. So,
yeah. And I think it's, well, in turn, like, you listed a lot of things that that are part of Red S, but we would also call like red flags or warning signs in a way for Red S. Yeah. And I guess when you think about underfueling and red, sorry, I keep saying Red S, reds. I have to get that habit.
Fine. Reds. You can call it Red S until October, and then you can't.
Until October, okay. I'm going to just get in the habit of saying it now, reds. I think of it as kind of this like spectrum, because of course it's really chronic underfueling and chronic low energy availability that kind of eventually leads to this place of depletion and all these, effects on the organ systems. But yeah, I mean, is there something that you would say differentiates between kind of between underfueling and kind of full blown reds? Is it like the number of symptoms, like when you're kind of assessing someone, and actually, I guess also a question is like, who is diagnosing reds? Like, how can you say someone definitively has reds? Because it's like, I feel like there's a lot of gray area in there. Do you know what I'm getting at? Yeah.
A lot of gray area. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of gray area.
So I think a couple things, there's actually a really interesting, and I'm not sure if you've like talked much about it, read much about it, but in the past couple years, we're learning more about essentially like what we call within day energy deficits versus like end of day energy deficits, from the standpoint of when you talk about like chronic low energy availability and how like problematic that can be and how that ends up leading to reds. There's been a lot of really interesting research, especially in the realm of like female bodied athletes specifically. Male bodied athletes are affected also, but it seems that female bodies are affected more severely from what we call within day energy deficits. And essentially what that means is an athlete could hypothetically like meet their energy needs at the end of the day. And so they are either in energy balance or maybe even an energy surplus by the time they go to bed. But if they've had a really like large and or prolonged energy deficit within the day, so within day energy deficits, that still can start to perturb or disrupt their hormonal function and their HPA axis and create a lot of those symptoms of reds as well. And I think that almost is one of the biggest problems. And like I see in terms of the area of unintentional underfueling. We're not talking about like intentional restricting or eating disorders, but just like timing. And people have no idea how important that role of timing is. And especially, if athletes are training in the morning and they don't want to eat before, like, it's kind of like, oh, well, it's okay. And, a lot of athletes aren't being intentional about getting adequate nutrition during and eating adequately before and then getting something in right after. And it's that time in and around training where you're going to have the greatest deficit in terms of energy during your day, the biggest kind of chunk, just because of the energy expenditure that goes into exercise. And so if you're not going into that adequately nourished and fueling adequately during and then getting something adequate after, you really run that risk of having a big deficit at that point. And so then you do try, and a lot of people think, oh, well, I can just, eat a big dinner, I can play catch up. And while hypothetically you might end up in energy balance by the end of the day, your body still went through a lot of damage during that time. And over time, that can add up, even if you are meeting your energy needs each day. If you're having those consistent deficits, that's the problem. And I think that was definitely kind of my experience early on, where I probably wasn't like, I was probably meeting my energy needs, but I just got in a really bad habit of like fasted training every day. And that was really problematic for my hormonal function and my bone health, etc. So that was, side trail. And now I can't remember the
No, but
your
this
question.
is, no, well, we were talking about kind of the gray area in the spectrum, but I think that's such an important thing to mention because, and I'll be fully honest, like there are times, and I know what to do, right? And I talk to my clients about, because there will be times where I am not practicing when I'm preaching. I always fuel before and I'm taking on stuff during whatever, but then maybe it's just not enough, or I wait a little too long afterwards, or things get off, I'm distracted, like whatever. You feel it. You definitely feel it, right? I feel like garbage, right? And it's not normal. You're not supposed to feel that way. And so I think the important, and some people are like, oh, well, I'm just so used to not eating breakfast. And, and so we're working on kind of trying to work it in. And the way I explain it to people, well, there are a few things at play. Like, first of all, meeting protein requirements, we know that we need to spread that out throughout the day. We don't want to just have one giant meal of protein or whatever, right? That's not the optimal way to get your protein in. So we really don't want to do that. And I talk to people about the difference between like feeling like you need something, or you can get away with doing something or whatever, and what you should do to really reach the goals that you're trying to reach and feel good. And I talk about eating opportunities, and that's why I'm always pushing for consistent eating and nutrient timing and all that stuff. And it's less about the recovery window necessarily than it is just about, hey, it's time to eat. It's been several hours. You were out running, whatever, So 100%. And I think it's all part of it's like a cog in the wheel, and it's all part of that bigger picture, and what kinds of patterns you're getting into as well. Because as you said, it's one thing if it's just you do this one day and it never happens again or whatever, and you'll probably feel it, as we said. But if you're doing this on a consistent basis, that's doing shit to your body.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think when people think about RED-S and underfueling or chronic underfueling, they're thinking more about, oh, where am I at the end of the day? Not necessarily what does the overall picture look like of my day, right? Or the individual parts. So I think that's super, super important. I thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
Yeah, and I don't remember what else I was getting at there either, but I think that's fine. I know what I was going to say. You mentioned unintentional, and that's kind of the next thing I want to talk about. You, of course, work with a lot of people who have disordered eating and eating disorders, and then, as we said, disordered eating is almost like normalized athlete eating for many people. And it's very tricky to kind of untangle or disentangle all of that, right? What's just being a very dedicated athlete versus what's, hey, that's actually disordered eating and not healthy for you. But then there are genuinely people who are trying hard. They think they're really getting everything they need in. They're doing their best, and they are still underfueling because their energy demands are just super high, or they just don't have the knowledge, or whatever it may be. And I think it's just interesting to kind of separate out those different paths. Oh, wait, are you still there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh, your picture disappeared. All right, that's fine. Just want to make sure I still am here recording you. Okay, cool. I can't see you, but that's fine. So I guess my question there is really how you are, and maybe this is a tricky question because I know everyone's path towards recovery is different and every client requires individualized recommendations, but maybe you can talk more broadly about the different approaches that you take here in these two types of situations where you do have someone who's genuinely trying to get there, but is in this bad place, and other people who are more intentionally kind of restricting when you're helping someone kind of with RED-S regain health and return to exercise.
So I think when it comes to the unintentional underfueling piece, I do say, so when I work with high school and collegiate student athletes, I think especially female bodied student athletes, just because I think there's a lot more stigma or normalization of a female person under eating. But I think high school and collegiate female student athletes that I work with are the most unintentionally underfueled group that I've ever worked with. And I've worked with, Olympians, pros, and everything in between because of a lot of different reasons, school schedule, and again, just no education, normalization, a whole host of reasons. So I think when it comes to this unintentional underfueling piece, I think it is either based on lack of education, or like really high training load. I think those are kind of the two components. And I think one of the hard things is, and I share this with, coaches and parents and athletes, is that the real bummer is that whether or not you have an eating disorder or you're just totally unintentionally underfueled, like the impact on your body is the same. It's not like, well, I'm not intentionally restricting, and so it's not as bad for my body. Like, unfortunately, it is. And I mean, from the like the one caveat is that you don't have to work through like the mental and psychological process, which is super grueling and exhausting, and those roots can run really deep and make things really challenging. But from a physical harm on the body, from bone, heart, immune system, et cetera, unintentional or intentional, your body doesn't know the difference. It just knows it's not getting enough. So, but I do think there is just, I mean, I think it's kind of split between those two categories of lack of education and just high training load, or both. I've definitely worked with athletes where it's a combination and they really have no nutrition knowledge and their training load is just crazy high. And so, or even just, again, like societal, fill half your plate with fruits and veggies. No, actually don't. Like,
yeah.
That's not what you should be doing. But I have so many athletes who are honestly like trying what they think is healthy eating, but it's not athlete eating. And there's a big difference between healthy athlete eating and like society's version of healthy eating. And I think that's the gap that really needs to be talked about more is, as an athlete, your plate should not be half veggies like all day, every day. That's going to cause a lot of, like, again, fiber is going to reduce absorption of other important nutrients. It's going to fill up your stomach. You're going to probably end up under eating, and you're probably going to end up with massive GI issues. And so you kind of have that piece where I definitely have some people come to me just interested in improving their fueling, maybe working on some GI issues, prepping for a race, whatever it is. And there generally is, I would say, 95% of the people who come to me, unintentional or not, are under fueling just because of the normalization of it. And so you do have that unintentional piece, and there it is. It's just like, it's education. It's teaching them, I kind of have 4 different, I talk about like fueling first, fueling fully, fueling freely, and fueling frequently are kind of my like 4 pillars. And so we'll kind of go through those, and I just talk about the role of complete meals and all the different food groups and proper timing and a lot of those things, and then helping them understand how to navigate things like the timing of training and eating and some of the fear around I'm going to have stomach issues when I run or whatever it is. And then you do have kind of that kind of spectrum into eating disorder. And obviously,
can I ask one question? Actually, I want to definitely want to address eating disorder. First of all, I love it was fueling first, fueling fully, fueling freely, and what was the last one? Frequently. Love it. And maybe, because one of my questions was, maybe you can give some practical advice to our listeners who want to make sure they're eating enough, but don't want to be counting calories or macros or kind of get into that tricky area, especially when there is, maybe it's not disordered eating necessarily, but if that's something that someone doesn't want to do, and we don't necessarily want to encourage that, especially with that fueling freely, which I think is part of that. But, it's that whole, like, how do we make sure we're getting enough without going down that road of tracking? How do we balance listening to our body, knowing sometimes we need more than it's telling us to? So I don't know if that plays into all the fueling first and fully and freely and frequently. If you want to expand upon that at all.
Yeah.
Yes, I would love to hear more about that.
I mean, I don't encourage tracking, generally speaking. I think it ultimately is like, does more harm than good in most spaces. Really the only time I'll get into numbers is if we're talking about like, if it's an ultra runner and we're looking at grams of carbs per hour or whatever. And so I think, I mean, it definitely is kind of those four pillars. And I mean, if I get into those quickly, fueling first, it kind of is fueling first, supplement second, where food first, supplement second, from the standpoint of, sure, like, calcium, vitamin D, magnesium for bones, iron for like, getting your ferritin up, etc., are all fine and good. But if your body's not getting adequate calories, those supplements aren't really going to do much of anything. And so understanding that while supplements can be really important, for sure for iron deficiency, vitamin D, bone health, very important. And they don't take the place of food. And then fueling fully is just including all food groups on your plate. So I think making sure you're getting carbs, proteins, fats, fruits and veggies with all meals, and helping athletes understand, like I talked about, that half their plate shouldn't be veggies all the time or fruits and veggies all the time, that fiber can actually be problematic for athletes, especially, depending on like if all their meals have a high fiber load. And so it's helping them understand most of the time, like that plate shouldn't be much more than a third of like those really high fiber veggies, and why. Fueling freely is incorporating all foods. I firmly believe that all foods fit. And so sometimes that carbohydrate on your plate might be a donut, and other times it might be quinoa, and they're ultimately equal. I always bring up this really great study by Brent Ruby from a few years ago, looking at recovery after intense bouts of exercise. And he had these athletes run through the same, bout of exercise twice with a washout period in between. And one time after the training session, they had, a like quote unquote healthy sports nutrition recovery meal. And after the second bout, or vice versa, it was crossover, they did a fast food meal, and the meals were matched for calories, carbs, fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals to make sure that, there was no discrepancy there. And then he actually did muscle biopsies and blood work to measure markers of inflammation and muscle recovery, and they were identical across both meals. And I think a lot of people are so surprised by the fact that the body can recover just as well from fast food as it can from like this healthy sports nutrition meal. But the body just knows macronutrients in so many regards. Like it knows it's getting carbs and how those break down, fats and how those break down, and proteins and how those break down. And so I think there's so much fear mongering with food that really gets in the way of people getting adequate nutrition and feeling like they have to find the right thing or the perfect thing. And so it's just helping people understand that like your body will do something with better versus nothing pretty much every time. And then the frequently piece, which, like I said, I think is probably one of the biggest areas that people struggle with. And that might mean, eating like 8 times a day, if that's like a snack before a morning training session, and then breakfast after, a morning snack, lunch snack, maybe 2 snacks between lunch and dinner, depending on the timing. And if there's another training session in there, and then dinner and an evening snack. And so really letting people know, like, you should be eating every 2 to 4 hours. As an athlete and active person, obviously that's going to vacillate a little bit. And then I think the other component is kind of demystifying this idea of like eat when you're hungry. And, intuitive eating is really great. I think there's a lot of important principles with intuitive eating. I think with athletes though, if you're only eating intuitively from the standpoint of eating when you're hungry, you're probably going to be underfueled. Yeah, because totally. A lot of people aren't hungry when they wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. to train, or they're not hungry right after, but you've got to get something in your body at those times. And so that's the other piece of it, is helping athletes understand that just because you're not hungry, it doesn't mean that your body doesn't need nutrition, and how to navigate that situation, how to find things that you can stomach when you're nauseous or when you're really not hungry. And there's no right or wrong. Like, it's finding what works for you. And that might be liquids or solids or sweet or salty or anything in between, but also really like personalizing that nutrition to them, because I think it's I don't want to have the wrong thing, or people get in this box of like, these are breakfast foods and I don't like breakfast foods, and so I'm just not going to eat breakfast. It's like, no, like in the United States, those are breakfast foods, but like, you can eat whatever you want, whatever you want.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt, but if you're enjoying this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to help me out. You can subscribe to the show, which is so helpful. You could share it with your friends or whoever else you think would be into it. You can rate and review the show wherever you listen. All of this supports me and helps me keep this show going and growing. You can also support me by heading on over to my Patreon page, which I'll link to in the show notes. You can donate $1, you can donate $3, $5, whatever you feel comfortable donating. This helps offset the costs that I pay personally for the show to keep going, since I don't have sponsors, and helps just support content creation. So I really do appreciate any donations you can make. Thanks so much. Let's get back to the episode.
So
in the Middle East, you have like the salads out, and you have all the meats and whatever.
Yep.
Like you can have anything at any time.
Yeah.
Totally.
So
no, for sure.
So I think like looking at like kind of those pillars is really how I talk to athletes about these are things you can do to kind of start to make sure you're not underfueling. And then it is also just talking about the symptoms of REDS that aren't talked about. How frequently are you getting sick or injured? GI distress. People so often think that, oh, if my stomach hurts, it means it's something that I ate or I ate too close to exercise. But just as often, it's because you didn't eat enough or you didn't eat close enough to exercise. So helping people understand that GI issues can actually come from inadequate nutrition. I think you pointed out this earlier and said it really well, kind of the normalization of like kind of feeling like crap or like feeling really tired during or after training. I remember that was a huge aha moment for me, like the first time once I got back to running after eating disorder treatment and started running, like eating before running. And I was like, it feels so good. And was just like not wrecked all the time. But I didn't realize how poor I felt until I didn't feel that poorly, if that makes sense. Like I didn't know how bad I had it until I was on the other side. And I think that's hard to speak to athletes about. But then I think from that, how do people make sure they're not underfueling without counting calories? I think that's the other piece of it, is being aware of those symptoms. Even things like libido, morning erections in males, a normal menstrual cycle for females, like all those things are also like things that you can be aware of. And it doesn't mean just missing your period completely. It can be a change in your cycle. It can be a shortened or lengthened cycle. It can be a lighter period. And so that's also where like tracking your cycle can be really helpful. So when those micro changes are happening and, nip them in the bud and kind of do something about them before, things get too bad. So.
Yeah. And I think kind of, going back to the whole, am I eating enough, tracking all this stuff, like going back to those pillars that you mentioned, you can sit there and kind of assess. And for anyone who's listening, you can do this on yourself. Like, are you doing those things right now in a very broad way before you get all like microscopic and looking at grams and blah, 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 whatever? Like take a really broad view look at what you're doing right now. Are you fueling before all workouts, even easy workouts? Are you fueling during workouts that are longer than an hour, let's say, or anything hard or whatever? Are you eating after, like just take a look at the consistency. How big are your meals? Like what's in your meals? Like just kind of play detective and get curious and take a look at all of that. Like no need to fast forward and start like, tracking every morsel into your body. Like, let's just like take a general look at things, And I will say too, one thing I'm really big on is just this aspect of fun. I talk a lot about just like having fun with what you're doing. And obviously we're not always going to love every workout or be all amped or whatever. We'll all have crap days, even though we're feeling well, come on, let's be real.
Yes.
And also there will be times where you're just like deep in the pain cave or whatever. But if you are not enjoying yourself while doing your sport and you're not having fun and feeling good, like there's something wrong there, and I think it really is linked to fueling, because if you are fueling appropriately and you're taking care of yourself and you're being smart about rest and recovery and training and all that stuff, like you should be feeling good, ideally, right? You should be feeling good. And if you feel good, you can enjoy. And if you're out on the trails like I am, like I've been really experiencing this lately. I'm just like soaking it all up. I'm having the best time. I'm feeling great. I have energy and it's great. It's fun because so all of this is linked to this stuff. And that's why it's so important. And now that I'm way on the other side, of course, it's easy to kind of look back and, and you were saying earlier, kind of relating to your younger clients of like, I've been there. Like, I work primarily with adults, but I definitely do have, a handful of collegiate and high school athletes. And you see people who are really in the thick of it and you remember what that is like. And that's also when I'm like, I have been there. Like, yes, it's different, but oh my God, I remember that. Yeah. And it took a really long time, but I'm on the other side of that. But anyways, so I think that's all great. And kind of in terms of also the whole not necessarily just eating when you're hungry, the way I like to think about it is, like intentional fueling or practical hunger or however you want to explain it.
Smart eating versus intuitive eating or athlete eating.
The one thing I would ask, because we're talking about like, or you hear people talk about like performance plates and, if you're an athlete, you should be, reducing your fruits and vegetables. When we say the word athlete, is there some sort of, and this might be hard to answer, but like, how active do you need to be in order to get, you know what I mean? Like, like, because I'm sure you work with a wide range of clients. I definitely have my kind of recreational, not necessarily doing crazy volume types clients. And then I have my 100 milers or 200 milers or whatever. So I have the whole range. At what point are you, in someone looking at someone's training volume, training load, and being like, okay, yeah, this is where we really need to focus more on this kind of athlete, I'm putting that in quotes, style of eating. I, of course, say that knowing as you increase training volume, obviously we're adjusting things, but you know what I mean? Like the way, what we're talking about now, who would you kind of call an athlete in that sense?
I mean, to be honest, I think that is something that I think if you move your body on purpose, you are an athlete.
100% agree.
And so obviously, like within that regard, there is such a huge range and of ages and genders and just needs and preferences and like medical situation, right? It's just like, it's a cascade. So I don't know if I can really answer that question outside of like, it really is like, it's a really personalized fluctuation of, just make sure you're meeting your energy demands, and also thinking about, exercise and like most movement is going to be some stress on the body, just because that's how like exercise and movement works. Like, while yes, a lot of forms of exercise are also really great for us physically and mentally, they are also a stressor on the body. And not only is that a stress, but people also, I think, don't take into account life stress as a stress load that also can have an impact on exercise and have an impact on your energy needs, or even things like having an active job. I'm working with a high schooler right now who's coming out of eating disorder treatment, and she's working at a deli 6 days a week. And to her, that is not exercise because she's a cross-country runner, but that is a big activity load. And so even helping people understand that there are other things that can factor in what your body is going to need from day to day, and being able to take kind of that whole picture for each person and consider it when you're looking at, because also like financial needs and cultural needs, dietary preferences, medical needs, like all those things go into, the nitty gritty of like how much and when, and even like, that performance plate of, I think for sure someone who is going to be doing a lot more training, especially if it's something like running or soccer, where there's a lot more stomach jostling, things like that, they need to be aware of that fiber load before they train, for sure. Whereas if someone is, maybe hopping on a bike or just going out for a walk, that's not going to have the same risk of stomach upset as the runner or the soccer player. So kind of within that, even there, none of those are better than the other, but there are nuances just from sport to sport. And so I think it's, just kind of understanding, okay, what are the role, like why am I eating, vegetables? What is the role of them? What are the pros and cons? Because vegetables also have cons, just like, whatever else we decide has cons. And so I think it really is just helping people understand kind of the when and the when, the what, and the why of those different food groups, so that they can feel confident. And I also like tell people that it's not an exact science. Your body's not gonna be like, no, a third of your plate was not this.
Yes.
Like it wasn't perfect thirds. Your body does a great job of adapting to your intake. And so I know so many athletes are pretty type A, and they get really caught up in, doing things perfectly or exactly. And so I also let them know, like, it doesn't have to be exact. Your body doesn't operate in these like 24-hour blocks. It's really like a continuum. And so there is just kind of that education too. So yeah, I don't know. I have a hard time saying, well, this after this activity level, we start to talk about the performance plates.
Totally.
So.
No, I love that answer. And I'm really glad you brought up that point of looking at other aspects of people's lives, and the reason I brought that up is, I mean, I agree. If you move your body, you're an athlete in my book. But we also have to obviously take into account as sports dietitians, like
Yes.
obviously there's a difference between someone who's just running a few miles here and there and someone who's training for an
100.
Ironman or whatever, you know, an ultra or whatever, right? Like there's a huge difference in what your energy demands are. But you do get people, and I certainly have had clients like this who are, maybe they're training for a half marathon or a marathon, or maybe they're even just kind of doing something, not even training for anything. But they're biking to and from work like 2 hours a day, and then they're like a nurse or something, and they're on their feet, you know, like there are all these other things, as you said, life stress, but also like physical stress, like I'm on my feet all day long, or I'm doing this, or I'm biking all over the place, or doing strenuous work at home, whatever it is. So we do take all those things into account, which, and I'm sure you do this in your initial intakes, like you're assessing the entire person's life, right? Like you're asking all these seemingly unrelated to nutrition questions. They're like, why the hell are you asking me about my commute to work? Because it's important, believe me. So, you know, we're really we're doing this full assessment to kind of account for these things, because if you are moving your body, in additional ways, it definitely affects your energy demands. So that's a really good point. So going now to the kind of the eating disorder side of things. So you are working with people who are actively in the recovery, like they have active eating disorders and they're seeking treatment, like they're inpatient as well, or like what types of clients are you, or outpatient clients? What type of clients do you have typically?
Good question. So, I mean, a little bit of a range. Like once I do an intake, I'll, determine if it's something that I feel comfortable doing on an outpatient basis, or if I think they need a higher level of care from the get-go. If I am working with someone with, they said, hey, like I really do their intake and they actually, I can tell there's, eating disorder present, or they come to me saying like, I've struggled with an eating disorder, or I am struggling with an eating disorder. I do their intake and I feel like comfortable with where they are. They're not in a medically compromised place. I will work with them pretty much all the time. I do apps that they work with if they are, or that they find a therapist. Because I think that's just a really important part of the process. Like, yes, being a dietitian who works at eating disorders, there is some semblance of therapy that I do, but that's not my scope. And there's a pretty fine line between what I can talk about as a dietitian, or what I should be talking about as a dietitian, and what I need to refer out to. And so I do generally recommend that. And then depending on kind of their signs, symptoms, medical history, I oftentimes will also have them be working with a psychiatrist for co-occurring, like, anxiety, OCD, etc., like medication management, and or a PCP to do like weight checks. And so there are times where I'll work with someone for a while, and then we just decide that like they need to go to a higher level of care for a little while. I've had, I think, two athletes over the last few years who we worked with them for a while, and while we made some improvements, like their roots were just pretty deep, and also, that puts a lot for high schoolers, that puts a lot of load on the parents, and sometimes even that just like is too much. And so I'll refer out at that point, and I have a couple different like eating disorder treatment places that I feel really, really confident in. And then, oftentimes they'll come work with me off the back end of that. So it does depend a little bit, even within kind of just that like realm of eating disorder. There's obviously a pretty big spectrum in terms of there's so many different types of eating disorders, and how each person experiences their eating disorder is very different. And so what's triggering one person is no problem for another. And so it's definitely kind of, working within the nuances of that. But so I do take a little bit of a range, but definitely have them working with a therapist and or either, psychiatrist or PCP or both. And then we'll have referred to a higher level of care from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a hard, so I work with people who either have history or more of in the disordered eating area, or I also have gotten people where they've come in completely like, I actually have gotten someone coming to me for weight loss, which I do very little now, but this was a while ago. Came to me for weight loss, raging eating disorder, total denial, ghosted me afterwards when I called him out on it. Like that happens.
Yep.
Yeah. It's eating disorder. I usually, I'm like you. Like I definitely assess, and even before I assess, I'll make sure I feel comfortable, and I
Yes.
refer out.
Yeah.
But it's really hard. It's hard work, and with people who are truly in the thick of it, this is often when well, not with surgery, but within true eating disorder, I'll refer out. And the progress sometimes that you make is like measured in just like millimeters. It's just it's a long road,
Yeah, it
and
is.
and so this is obviously like a huge topic, and I'm trying to figure out what my question is here. But maybe it's more just in the context of what we've been discussing so far. Is there anything you kind of want to say about your work with athletes with eating disorders and what that kind of journey looks like, or the types of things it's such a broad category and it's so different for everybody, I still, and you don't have to say anything else if nothing else comes to mind that makes sense to say here, but just giving you the opportunity to say anything else if you want to on this topic.
Yeah, no, I think so. Obviously, we kind of talked about, those athletes who are unintentionally underfueled. And then with eating disorders, it still is a lot of that same stuff, but you do have that psychological mental component. And so it's generally working with their therapist and having regular communication with them, getting, if maybe I was the first person they started working with, it's, updating the therapist or vice versa. But having that team, like cohesive approach is really, really important. And then I always have, athletes fill out like a fear foods and food rules forms. And they're kind of a working document. I tell them, like, I do not expect you to be able to think of all the foods that you're afraid of and all the rules you have around food or exercise of your body now. You're going to be adding things over the course of weeks, months, etc. And, but that really informs a lot of the work that we do in sessions. And, from week to week, with my athletes with eating disorders, or even just a little bit of, disordered eating, or even just people who have like lost their cycle sometimes, I use a couple different apps for like a photo food log where they don't have to weigh, they don't have to measure, they don't have to write things down, but they just snap a photo and upload it. And it gives me a really good idea of like portions and volumes and that kind of thing. And so, with that, we use that kind of week to week, and I can check in on things. And, we'll use kind of the things that are in their fear foods and food rules as goals throughout the week. And I also do challenge meals with my athletes. And so if they're in person in Seattle where I live, we might do them in person. But if they're virtual or if they're somewhere else in the country, then we'll do them virtually. And that could mean eating a food together that they're afraid of, or it could mean, again, like breaking a food rule that they might have. And so that's a regular thing that I do with my athletes, just to work on continued exposure and having that kind of support of someone kind of doing the same thing they're doing, having, being able to like kind of talk through it, help them through it. Or, whatever it might be. And then it is, doing a little bit of that, helping them kind of work through, well, where did these beliefs come from? Walking them through, I hate to say like irrational, because there's like so many of our eating disorder behaviors ultimately have become like they're protective in many different ways, right? Yeah. But so many of the fears that people have with eating disorders are in many ways irrational. And so it's just helping to like educate them and support them through that process. A lot of the athletes who come to me with or without eating disorders have also lost their period. And so it might also be adjusting exercise. That's kind of the last route that I want to go down. But sometimes it has to happen. Normally it's okay, how can we optimize your health and performance through food first? And, sometimes I do use an exchange plan with some athletes if that's the support they need. But a lot of times it's just working with, hey, okay, like I see that, you're restricting carbohydrates at both meals. Let's like work on including carbohydrates with at least like 2 meals this week. And then we work on that, okay, how does this feel? How does this feel? Okay, now can we include carbohydrates for all 3 meals? And so for a lot of people, it's just setting, small goals like that. And then sometimes there will be a little bit of like exercise modification, whether it's decreasing the intensity or the frequency. I've only had a few athletes that I've worked with where we really had to cut exercise completely just to the length of their amenorrhea or lack of a period, and potential other confounding factors like low bone density or bone stress injuries or bradycardia, like low heart rate. So yeah, those are kind of some of the different things that we'll kind of work through in the process.
Yeah, and I definitely, that whole like the food rules, the food fears, all of that, that's actually something I do with a lot of, because I mean, again, disordered eating, or at least some version thereof, is so common.
Yes.
And you kind of identify, and sometimes these things are almost like they're unintentional. Like,
they're subconscious.
Like, I know, yeah. No, I'm like, I notice you never add, and like, I notice you always have a salad at lunch and you never eat carbs.
Yeah.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, or like, you only have protein and vegetables at dinner. You know, but so with a lot of my athletes, as one of the exercises we do right off the bat in the first session, it's like part of your homework, you know, is to sit down and think about, do I have any food rules that I've kind of created for myself? And they can be very intentional. Like, I can only eat a bagel on a long run day, which is definitely one I have heard many times, or unintentional or subconscious, whatever, just as they come up, or maybe they're fear foods. And there's a lot of, obviously, like, if I eat this, I'll get fat. That's a very common one, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And that's almost entirely what the list entails, is if I eat XYZ, I will get fat.
Yeah. Or it'll make me slow, or
exactly. But almost always it's some version of fat, because fat will make me slow. Yeah. So it's like some version of that. So just wanted to mention that here as another thing, again, that for anyone listening who just wants to kind of do a little self-assessment and get curious about stuff, like, you can sit down and write these things out for yourself and challenge yourself to maybe try some of these things, and just think about, like, just becoming more aware as the first step. Or of course, seek help from a dietitian. That's always the best thing. Like, obviously, if you have an actual eating disorder, please don't try to do this by yourself. Please seek help. I was thinking more from if somebody is just curious and they're doing fine and they're just curious about these things.
I think even
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think even one example, like that, an athlete that I was working with a few months ago even realized we were eating ice cream together, and she's like, I just realized that I only eat ice cream out of this dish. And I was like, oh, why do you think that is? And she was like, well, I think it limits the amount of ice cream that I can have. And I was like, that is an awesome awareness. And so I was like, okay, well, like, how would you feel about the next time you get ice cream, like putting it in a completely different dish? Or even what would it feel like if you just ate it out of the container? But even things like that, like what dishes that we put things in or portion things into. I had an athlete today, and we were eating trail mix together for a snack. And it was the same thing. Like, she only puts trail mix in this one bowl because it limits the amount, and she knows the amount that fits in that bowl. So even things like that, where it's, you know, a specific plate size or whatever that you're eating on, that people might not really think of as being a food rule, but that is a food rule.
But don't you remember, like, that, you know, it was ages ago, where I think it was like coming out of the Cornell, and I know there's some scandal with the Cornell professor or whatever, but the guy who was like, eat with a small plate, and like, if you eat with a smaller plate, like, blah, 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 whatever.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, it's like all that BS, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm sure some version of that, you know, advice is still circulating widely. No, for sure. And I totally just forgot what I was going with this. I know what I was going to say. For an example for me, though, is like, I just stopped eating mayonnaise at for a long time, like way, way, way back when I had my eating disorder, whatever. And I just never brought it back for no particular reason. It just was something I never bought. And one day I remember when my older daughter was very young, and one of my mom friends had mayonnaise, and she was like dipping it in something, and I was like, oh yeah, mayonnaise. I just like literally, and like, I automatically order sandwiches just with mustard. Like, it's not intentional at all. Just, you know, just what I do. And then I'm like, oh yeah, mayonnaise. I'm like, I forgot about mayonnaise. And like, I was making myself some tuna fish, and I put some mayo. I'm like, this is delicious. Like, oh yeah, this is actually like, in my
really
mind, I was
good.
like, I think in my mind, I was thinking mayonnaise is gross.
Right.
Like, that's why I thought I just didn't like it. But I'm like, no, I took mayonnaise away because I thought it was fattening and bad for me. And actually, it's delicious. And I just made myself a nice tuna salad today with mayonnaise.
Bad for you.
Yeah, it's great. And I remember in my food science class, we made homemade mayonnaise, which was also very tricky, but delicious. So hard to make, though. Just break the emulsion. But no, it's very good. And so it's like, again, it's these things
Mm-hmm.
that we just don't even think about
Yeah.
sometimes. You convince yourself you don't like something,
Mm-hmm.
and that was maybe in your eating disorder. And then way down the line, you're like, oh shit, I actually forgot about that and I thought didn't like it, and actually it's yummy, and let's
Yeah.
bring that back. So again, challenging everyone to just be aware of these things
Yeah.
because they creep in.
Yeah,
they really do.
And I have my athletes talk about preference, where
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, is this a like, if you say, yeah, so is this a preference or is this a fear? And so I'll not only get fear foods, but I get dislikes. And then we'll challenge that dislike list and say, okay, is this a true dislike preference or is it a fear? And I remember for me in treatment, I had a very, very long list of fear foods and dislikes. I mean, not really dislikes.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of, like, I told myself they were dislikes, but they were fears. Things like Oreos or certain kinds of donuts. But I went through the entire list and I would like highlight something if I actually liked it and then cross it off if I didn't actually like it. And there were very, very few items on this gargantuan list of things that I truly did not prefer and like would eat if I had to. Like goldfish crackers, just not my preference. Like I really am not a giant fan of them, but if they were there and I was hungry, I would eat them. But yeah, so even being able to, like you said, check in, like, is this truly my preference or do I think this is my preference? Is also, and also our taste buds change, like not only as kids, but like as adults, your taste buds change. So even if it was your true preference 10 years ago, you may find it awesome now. So that's also,
I was just about to mention that in the reverse. Like I remember as a kid or even in my early 20s, like loving, and this is funny, is like one of the foods I would have trouble controlling myself around when I was younger was like a Cadbury cream egg, like, the coming out east or whatever. I tasted one not long ago being like, oh, Cadbury cream egg. It was disgusting. Like I can't not even, or even just like a normal Reese's peanut butter. I don't know what it is, but like, or Peeps or those things. Like I tried eating those things. I generally wanted to enjoy it. And I was like, this is gross. Like I don't like that.
Not your preference.
Yeah. Not my preference, and not to yuck anyone's yum. Sorry. If someone really wants to eat that, please enjoy it. Anywho, okay. Let's move on to menstrual cycle nutrition. I know we kind of started touching on it a little bit. And we're specifically talking about the loss of your period in the context of red S, right? Or just chronic underfueling. And, as we said, like this is a really big deal among female-bodied athletes. And even though it's very common, it is not normal, healthy, or okay. So I'm wondering, how you are approaching, again, you started to talk about this, but how you're approaching working on getting the period back, and what kind of, like what this kind of recovery period might look like. And again, I know everybody's different, but what are kind of some of the broad strokes here that you're kind of looking at?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head. Everybody's different. And that's one of the hard things about it is I can't have an athlete come to me and say, you will get your period back in a month, 2 months, 6 months. Like,
totally.
If I wish it was that easy. But definitely first step is me getting their menstrual history from the standpoint of like, have you ever had a period? Some athletes will come to me at the age of 16, 17, never had a period before, 18, 19 even. And so it's, okay, did you have your very first period at what age? And then, when was your most recent period? How long are your cycles normally? It's getting a little bit of that information to understand how long they've gone without a cycle, or without a period. And, if it's just a couple months, has it happened before? Does this happen every season? Which is a pretty common thing for a lot of athletes, especially high school and college athletes, to lose their period during their season. But like you said, just because it's common, it's not normal and it's not healthy and it shouldn't be happening. And it's also not good for performance. I think a lot of athletes are like, oh yes, I don't have to deal with it. This is awesome. But your period is an ergogenic aid. Like it is a performance enhancing part of being like, it is performance enhancing from just a hormonal standpoint. And so that's also, I mean, health first, but I think some athletes are like, I don't care about having kids. I just want to perform well. And so you also can let them know, actually, you'd be a better athlete with a period. And this is why. So there it is, getting a little bit of menstrual history. And then And then, yeah, it's, working with, okay, if they even say they haven't had their period for a year, I'm probably not, first thing I'm going to do is not to just not allow them to exercise, because that's, a big part of their community and their, mental health and their identity. Like, I'm not going to just blanket take that away, because we know we don't necessarily have to. Some people you do have to, but I will always address food first. And it really comes to those 4 pillars I talked about, right? Of like, fueling fully, getting enough, focusing on all the food groups. I do think when we're looking at getting our periods back, we definitely do bring down the fiber and bring up the carbohydrates and the fats. Just from female physiology standpoint, we need more carbohydrates than male counterparts oftentimes, and fats are really important for hormones. Like, our hormones are solely made up of fats, and so we've got to be getting those fats in. And so I'm really focusing on the carbohydrates and fats, bringing down the fiber a little bit, just because it does prevent a lot of important nutrient absorption, even some specific, vitamins and minerals that are important for that hormonal production process. And then, yeah, making sure they're eating frequently enough. Eating in and around exercise is a hard yes. It has to happen. That's a big place of error, kind of like I mentioned already, that a lot of athletes aren't getting enough nutrition before and or after exercise. And so that's a really easy change to make, to not only get more energy in their body, but to support that hormonal system. Especially, high school athletes, many of them don't have a snack between, lunch and when they're starting practice. Or if they do, it's really small. It's like an apple or an orange or something, which is better than nothing, but not adequate. And then, so those are kind of the primary components. We're, optimizing total nutrition, focusing on a couple specific food groups, working on the frequency. And then there we might have to, after trying that for a little while, if we don't, or we'll usually start there, and depending on what their training load looks like at the time and where they are in their season, if they're in the middle of their season, I'm not going to tell them they can't train. If they're medically compromised, different story. But if outside of not having their period, everything else looks fine, like I'm normally checking their orthostatic heart rate. So I'm looking at their, essentially just kind of some heart rate data that they can check at home to make sure that their heart is healthy. Those types of things. If I feel confident, like they're medically okay, they can keep exercising during the season. But if it's out of season, it's things like, ideally they're not exercising 2 days in a row, or we're bringing down the exercise intensity. And so they're going to do, keep exercise under an hour, kind of easy to moderate pace, 6 days a week with a full rest day. And so definitely, it varies person to person, but when it comes to exercise modification, like I said, the first thing I'll generally move is intensity. This is the hardest on the body and on our kind of hormonal system. And I do really emphasize rest days between exercise days, or especially the hard days where they're getting a true rest day. And so even if an athlete, say, is a triathlete or they lift weights and run, I make sure that they are lifting weights on their run days so that rest day can be a true rest day. I would rather them run and lift weights a couple of days a week, like on the same day, and then have a full true rest day between those days, versus run 3 days a week, lift the 3 days in between, and have a full rest day. Even then, related, unrelated, I don't actually, funny that I said it, I don't actually use the word rest days. I use the word rebuild days, because
I like that.
As much as athletes feel like they're resting, because we have a twisted sense of like what is exercise, the body's actually not really resting on the day that you're not exercising. It's trying to rebuild itself from all of the breaking down that it underwent when you were exercising. And so I think just that reframe and helping people understand, because a lot of people have a hard time like eating on rest days, right? Like there's that guilt around, oh, like I shouldn't be as hungry, I shouldn't eat as much on rest days. But if you can help them understand, like your body is doing a lot of work on this day to actually make you fitter and like allow you to have those training applications, and it needs the building blocks to do so. So those are kind of some of the things that I'll do from a period management standpoint. I do always, ideally, if they've lost their period, I have them get a bone density scan, just so I can know what their bone density looks like. Some of them may have already had a bone stress injury in their history or currently, but technically, their bone density might be fine, but that bone stress injury history is good for me to know. And then I will generally ask them to get a bone density test done just so I can know like where that stands. And do we need to look at additional supplementation? Are there things I need to be aware of, even from an exercise standpoint? Because that's something where if their bone density isn't great, especially for their age, and they don't have a period, I will be more likely to adjust exercise, do more shorter bouts of exercise, do a lot more like loading type exercises. So that's where, adjustments might come. And then, like I said, definitely if their like heart rate stuff is at all kind of skewed, that's definitely where exercise modifications will come in.
That's super helpful. Thank you. How are you dealing with hormonal birth control?
Oh, how long do we have?
I see this from, okay, I literally, and I'm so interested in this as someone, I never lost my period, and I got my period when I was 12, but I went on hormonal birth control when I was 18, when, right before my eating disorder took over. And I was on hormonal birth control for a total of 20 years. Yeah, you too. Okay.
Not quite that long, but
birth control
close.
pills. And of course, and I talked about this with another dietitian, of course, they don't tell you all the things that does.
No, it was supposed to get my period back and protect my bones. Neither of which it does.
Mine was just contraception, and I again never had lost my period, but like I went through all the times where I was basically not diagnosed, but probably basically anorexic or bulimic, all those things. And I have no idea if I ever lost my period because I was on birth control the entire time. I just really wish I knew what my baseline was. And I can't remember what it was like when I was 12 and 13, So it's just really interesting to me. And then thinking back, so I'm off of it now, thankfully, but that's just such an interesting thing to me when you get a client who clearly has, maybe they're coming to you with a stress fracture, they're clearly under fueling. You can't use the period as a sign of anything. So it's tricky.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And I don't know about you. Like, I definitely have had clients who also are resistant. Like, they will not go off their birth control.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that from kind of a treatment perspective?
Yeah, I first, again, kind of my step one generally always educate. So I always ask, like, why are you taking birth control? Is it contraception? Some of my athletes, their doctor did put them on birth control to get their period back. And I'm like, actually, like, that isn't your period. It's just a withdrawal bleed, and there's a big difference. And so it's always finding out why. Like, why are you on birth control? And or IUD, like whatever they're using. So it's finding out why. And then the specific, type of contraception does make a big difference, right? So, like an oral birth control pill would be like a combined pill would be my least favorite and least preferred option. It does not protect our bones, and it doesn't give you a period. You just have a withdrawal bleed. And there can be a lot of just negative side effects in general, but aside from those, like for me, I didn't have any negative side effects with my oral birth control. And then you have the IUD, various forms of IUDs, which, unlike a birth control pill, which completely flatline your natural hormones, you still are going to have like some of your natural hormones cycling and fluctuating a little bit. You generally can still test for like ovulation or even like body temperature and heart rate changes, which are signs of like a normal cycle. They aren't as detrimental to bone health. And even though many athletes do lose their period on the IUD, so you don't have the actual bleed, you still can track body temperature. You still can track resting heart rate as well as other symptoms, because some people will still have those natural fluctuations. And then there's the estrogen patch, which is not contraceptive, but does help with increasing bone density. It's the one endogenous or essentially when I say endogenous estrogen, it means like the estrogen that my body creates on its own. So the estrogen patch is the one non-endogenous estrogen form, including IUD and oral birth control, that does actually help protect bones. And so sometimes athletes will have to go on that if they have, they're borderline osteoporotic and they've lost their cycle and kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's always, asking why, learning about what type, how long, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think for younger athletes now, I think birth control is more common. And so I have that discussion around, hey, this actually is not great for your bones. It's not giving you a natural period. And, sometimes I've had athletes, shift to an IUD. Sometimes they stay on it, kind of like you said, like they won't go off it, and it is what it is. Are
you doing copper versus non-copper? Do you have like a preference there? Nutritionally?
I think there is some variation in, again, just the fact that like copper is non-hormonal. And so I think, in my opinion, like the more of your own normal hormones you can have, the better. I think there is also some preliminary data, if I'm correct, that there are more positive associations and less negative associations with the non-hormonal copper IUD compared to the hormonal. But honestly, like copper or like Mirena or other kind of hormonal IUDs, because the natural hormones aren't flatlined completely, and there is still a little bit of an ability to check for, heart rate and body temperature fluctuations, even if the period's not there. That's, I think, a bonus. And for anybody, regardless of oral birth control or IUD, various types of IUDs, if we don't have that period to say, okay, things are okay, even in a person without an IUD, I mean, I was in, treatment with athletes, or not athletes, I was in treatment with people who full-blown eating disorders never lost their period and were not on anything. Like, the body's just crazy resilient. And so just because someone hasn't lost their period, it also doesn't mean that they're not struggling with REDs, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's also an important differentiation, because there are a lot of times where athletes will maintain a normal cycle and still be struggling with REDs, just because it does affect every body differently. But if someone doesn't have that kind of helpful sign, we're like, okay, you are getting a normal cycle, you're getting a normal period, kind of that little bit of reassurance, then it just does take a lot more being super in tune with our body in terms of, okay, what are all these other like early warning signs of REDs? And I need them to be very aware of some of those. Oftentimes I'll have athletes fill out the LEAF Q, which is the low energy availability in females questionnaire. So it's essentially like a questionnaire for female bodied athletes to assess risk of low energy availability. And there's one for males that's still being tweaked in order to be like really, really accurate. But so it's just a lot more. You need to be aware of the other symptoms and other warning signs. And there's just a lot more, there's sometimes blood work that you can do that can help a little bit. And then it's just, a lot more onus is on them to eat adequately. And usually when they do get the education around the role of a period and the role of a cycle from a health and performance standpoint, if they don't have, full-blown eating disorder, there is a lot of motivation to pay attention to signs and symptoms, to eat enough, because they do want to perform well. They do want to have good bone health, they do want to have a strong heart, all these different things. And so, like I said, I think kind of from square one, my approach is education, because that also generally allows for a lot more buy-in from them as well, to either explore other options and or just be intentional about doing the work on the food side of things.
Yeah. And I know you work, as you said, with a lot of high school and collegiate athletes, and, that population is always challenging because of, caring greatly about what other people are doing and peer pressure and all this stuff. And of course it can work both ways. If there's good, positive peer pressure to fuel yourself, that's wonderful. But I know I've certainly worked with plenty of student athletes who no one is fueling, and their coach isn't necessarily telling them. And I know you give, talks to coaches as well, I believe, and kind of these seminars and things. And it's really hard to get someone to make changes when there just isn't this culture surrounding eating or drinking,
Yeah.
So I think just, again, continuing the education piece and getting people to be willing. I mean, that's really, the kind of eating disorder piece aside, just getting people to be willing to do this and to make it really part of the athlete culture, is so key,
Yeah. And coaches and parents, oftentimes can be pretty harmful. Sometimes even like inadvertently, they may not even be talking about their kids' bodies or talking about their food, but I think there's just a lot of just old school nutrition beliefs that, run pretty deep. And when coaches are telling their kids not to eat junk food, or parents are closing the kitchen at night, not letting their kids have nighttime snacks, things like that, thinking they're doing what they should. But I think that's definitely, one of the biggest barriers that those young athletes face is they're getting so much nutrition information from parents and coaches. And then like social media is just another topic in itself. But, usually those parents and coaches don't have a lot of nutrition education, and the beliefs they hold aren't always helpful. So when they should be able to look to kind of those people for support and help, that's not always how it works out.
Yeah, and especially when you have someone who's young and who's under fueling, and they're maybe kind of getting into more binge style behavior or secret eating, they're craving sugar, their mom's like, sugar's bad, hiding those types of things, or and you're trying to like encourage more consistent eating, but then like I mean, I'm describing kind of a combination of clients I've had. They don't want to eat at school because no one's eating at school, and I'm embarrassed to bring the snack to school and no one else is snacking, but then I'm binging at night, and then the mom's like locking things up, and it's like this whole I'm just it's such a hard, it's so
spot on.
It's so, there's so much, or like the school won't let you eat. There's so many components, or I don't want to carry a lunchbox. That's embarrassing. That's lame. There's just so many components to this. I mean, I've probably worked with far fewer clients in this age group, but I've worked with enough to get the full spectrum of it. And it's, I understand that like wanting to work with a younger population to really make a difference and help people avoid a lot of the hurt and struggle that you went through. And also it is so hard.
And sometimes it is. It's like the kids are great, but the parents drive me bonkers.
That too. All right. I know we're about out of time, and I hate to throw the male-bodied athletes in the last minute thing here. I know we're mostly. Do you have to run right now?
No.
Do we want to shut? Okay. All right.
Totally
I can ask you another question. Cool. I heard the timer. I was like, oh no. So yeah, I know you mostly work with female-bodied athletes, but I know there are some male-bodied athletes out there listening to this. I know. So, and a lot of what we said, like, look, I know a lot of what we said related more to women, but or female-bodied athletes, but there is a lot out there that is still, that men can take that with them. But is there anything else we want to talk about? I mean, you mentioned libido and morning erections, that kind of stuff. Is there anything else that is really specific to men that you want to throw out there, discuss, that we haven't already talked about?
I mean, it's definitely, I think the morning erections piece is the one that is really, really indicative for male-bodied athletes, where like they should be having morning erections. And if that's not happening, then like that's one of the key indicators in a male-bodied athlete of REDS, or low energy availability. Obviously, other things can be going on as well. Like, it's not like, okay, you definitely have that, but it should be a warning sign. I think the hard thing with males is like eating disorders and mental health are already so stigmatized, and it's definitely getting better and there's more language around it. But just because people still assume, like, when they think of eating disorder, they think of like a thin Caucasian female-bodied like runner is like stereotypical eating disorder, right? People don't think that like fat bodies can have anorexia, or like you don't see as much talk about like people of color in the eating disorder space, or males. And so, we know that like 20% of those diagnosed with anorexia are males, but that's just diagnosis. And so I think that actually if males felt more seen, and there was more permission for men to have eating disorders, that we would see that diagnosis percentage be a lot higher. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, all the symptoms of REDS, all the same, regardless of what gender you are, all those like fueling principles I talked about, all the same, really kind of the one difference is we're looking at like morning erections for male-bodied people, loss of a menstrual cycle for female-bodied people, but everything else pretty much, goes across genders. So
yeah. And the one thing else I'll also throw out there is just the role of stress, like life stress we talked about. but like if you're under a ton of stress, you know, I know some women, whether they're athletes or not, may lose their period, you know? And I imagine it affects your libido and your erections as men.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure, but I would imagine that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think there, as we said, there are lots of different factors at play here. And we're primarily talking about athletes and nutrition here, but just kind of remembering, like with everything, there are often a lot of things going on behind the scenes. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add to this discussion that we haven't already kind of brought up?
No, I mean, I think maybe just kind of to touch on your last point, you know, since the topic of this is REDS, and you said, you know, we've talked a lot about athletes, and technically, you know, REDS stands for relative energy deficiency in sport, but just because it has sport in the name and like the focus is this is what happens to athletes, REDS or like low energy availability can also happen in non-active or less like non-athletes in quotes.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's just like your body's not getting enough nourishment to meet its needs and it gets stressed and your like metabolism starts to shift and slow down. And so that can happen to anyone. Like you said, stress is a huge part of that, regardless of, you know, exercise or nutrition intake or whatever. And so you don't also have to be like label yourself, quote unquote, as an athlete to struggle with like low energy availability or REDS either. And I think that's important to talk about because I think it can be a little bit of a misnomer because sport is in the name, it's in the acronym.
Yeah.
So
100%. Yeah. And that kind of reminds me of, you know, like that kind of going back to part of, and that's partly why I asked that question about athlete earlier, like about how we define athlete, because I think there are a lot of people out there who wouldn't necessarily call themselves an athlete, even though they move. And maybe they're just like, oh, I'm hopping on my Peloton every once in a while and I'm going for a 3-mile run or whatever.
Yeah.
And, or maybe they're not active at all, but you know, as I like to remind everyone, like you sitting on the couch, you are burning lots of energy. Your body has worked really hard to keep yourself alive. And this is why you don't need to earn your food. I mean, there are a billion reasons why you don't need to earn your food, but like, you know, there's so many things going on that you can't see or feel that your body is doing for you because our bodies are amazing and we should be so happy we have them working well. And so I think that's an important piece. And as you said, like we can be in this state of chronic underfueling as a sedentary person, as a person who's injured between being active, whatever, in any situation, you know, like you can be chronically underfueled and in this state of REDS, if we want to, you know, in that context. So I think that's a huge thing to say, that even if you don't call yourself an athlete, this is something that you want to watch out for. And this it feeds back into that normalization of, you know, quote unquote healthy eating, clean eating,
skipping meals, or the glorification of
exactly. Like I just want to lose weight, whatever it is, you are all in this zone of like, hey, let's watch out for this stuff. I think that's a really great place to end things. And I'm just going to ask you my few quick bites questions to wrap things up. What is your favorite pre-workout meal or snack? They're not hard, I promise.
I would either, if I'm looking for something liquid, I do really like UCAN, both their discontinued flavors, which is the cocoa and the cinnamon. Or I will do a banana or a Pop-Tart. Those are probably my go-tos.
Okay, so UCAN, maybe I need to give it another try. I am not on the UCAN train here. I don't know what it couldn't get it to like dissolve or something. I don't know what it was.
It's definitely, the consistency is different than any other drink, which is why I actually don't use it during exercise. Okay. And the reason I don't really like the fruity flavors either, but the reason I like the chocolate is because it's like chocolate milk. Like the consistency makes it like chocolate milk, and I really like chocolate milk, and so it's just like I'm drinking chocolate.
Maybe I need to try this again. So, they sent me samples like a trillion years ago.
They've also come a long way, and they have. Their bars are way better.
Okay, maybe I'll give it another try, because this was like way before they had the gels and all this, and they sent me samples. I tried to shake it up; it was chunky. I was like, I'm not drinking this. This looks disgusting.
It's come a long ways.
Okay, I'll give it a second shot. All right. I know it's very popular. What about post-workout meal or snacks?
So snacks, shelf-stable chocolate milk. I have a snack box that I keep in my car. Shelf-stable chocolate milk is always in there. So again, I would do something like that and or a Pop-Tart. If I want something salty, it would be like peanut butter pretzels or even like chips and like pickles, something like that, salami, cheese. Or if it's a meal, if it's hot out, I would do like a loaded smoothie with, like fruit and some protein like Greek yogurt or protein powder or whatever, like some nut butter thrown in there, etc. And then top it with granola or put some oats in it. Or I'll do overnight oats, or like a loaded yogurt bowl. And then if it's cold outside, I love making like gourmet breakfast sandwiches on like an everything bagel.
Yum.
And just like load it up. I do make a good breakfast sandwich if I do say so myself. So
lovely.
Those would be
love it. What has been your biggest cooking catastrophe, if you've had one?
Oh, biggest cooking catastrophe. Trying to think. I must have one. Oh well, I guess this could count. I put it was several years ago. I don't even remember what I made. It was some casserole type something. Because it was in a casserole dish. I don't know if it was like enchiladas or lasagna or whatever. But I had forgotten the burner on my stove was hot still. It was like one of the old stoves that didn't actually give you the signal light that it was hot. And so I put the casserole dish, on the hot burner and it exploded. And so there was like glass and casserole all over the kitchen. That would probably be
that
the
sounds
biggest
horrible.
disaster. Yeah.
That sounds like a disaster to me.
Yes, it was a disaster.
How do you like your eggs cooked?
Oh, most times would be fried over easy with a runny yolk, and I will pop the yolk and dip toast or whatever in it. Would generally be my go-to, no question.
What is your favorite beverage?
Coffee, iced coffee. I drink iced coffee year round, preferably nitro cold brew.
Ooh,
like
you're
if
one
I
of
could
those
drink
people.
nitro cold brew every day. Oh, it is so good.
Can you make your own of that? Or no, you guess you'd have to have like a tap or something, huh?
Yeah, there was this company that was selling. It was like one of those Instagram ads that I almost got suckered into, and they'd sell like the nitro thing and the cold brew coffee, but it was like one nitro canister only made 2 cold brews, and I was like, this makes
expensive.
No sense at all. So I do have a coffee shop, Issaquah Coffee Company, that's like just on the border of the mountains where I run, and I usually work there before coming back into the city, so they now know my order and my name, and my dog's name, and my dog's order, so
Wait, what's your dog's order?
Oh, just a pup cup, which is just a cup of whipped cream.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
That's so sweet. I love it. Clearly I don't have dogs, but that's very cute. Like, what would the dog order? Like steamed milk? No. And what are your comfort foods?
Ooh, I would say graham crackers and milk. Was like favorite bedtime snack as a kid. My mom's spaghetti. Her spaghetti sauce is like mind-blowingly good. So my mom's spaghetti. I mean, just like fresh hot bread, like a crusty bread with like butter or olive oil is just, it's not like a comfort food from, when I think comfort food, I think of like food from that I liked when I was a kid. But that is also just like, it is so good. Or like the smell of toast. Toast and then peanut butter, just because I go through an ungodly amount of peanut butter. Yeah, those would
lovely.
Those would be up there.
What's your favorite ice cream flavor?
I just like ice cream with lots of things in it. So I'm normally not like a chocolate base person. I'd probably go for like a peanut butter or a vanilla base, but like lots of things. So I like Ben and Jerry's ice cream because their ratio of things to ice cream is really good. I would generally not go for an ice cream like just like a plain like vanilla or like a plain chocolate. Like I want lots of chunks and things to like chew on.
So wait, were you like a Cold Stone Creamery kind of person where you're just like loading it up with everything?
No. I never liked Cold Stone for whatever reason. I think the ice cream was too, I don't know, like smooth or like whipped almost for me.
Okay.
So yeah, no, I've never been a Cold Stone fan. But my girlfriend and I do normally have like 4 to 6 flavors of ice cream in our freezer at all times.
What's your favorite brand? Do you have like a go-to?
Ben and Jerry's for sure.
Ben and Jerry's, right?
Consistency is really good. There is a private selection lemon cheesecake that's really good. Umpqua has a chocolate peanut butter that's crazy good. So there's a few like select flavors of certain brands that we found that are good, but I would say Ben and Jerry's Van Leeuwen is a bougie but very good ice cream. Jenny's is also a bougie but very good ice cream.
So good though.
And then there's a local company called Frankie and Joe's that is also very bougie but very good. So that's my spectrum of ice creams.
No, where I lived in New York City, I lived kind of like on the edge of the East Village, and I think I had like 6 different bougie shops around me, including Van Leeuwen was one of the shops, and we would just kind of like, jump around the different ones, and it was amazing.
Yeah, we hadn't ever heard of their ice cream, and then we went to one of the fancier grocery stores, I don't know, a couple months ago at this point, and just like the brand caught her eye, and so she got a couple flavors, and yeah, we were very, very impressed. Unfortunately impressed considering the cost of the pint.
Yeah. But it is costly.
It is what it is.
Costly. Yep. And last but not least, top 3 items of gear that are most essential to your active lifestyle.
Oh, my trail running shoes. Oh man, now I'm thinking about all the different activities, skiing and climbing.
You gotta choose.
I know. I'm gonna
your favorite baby.
I know. I'm gonna say my running pack, my trail running shoes, and then I would say my gravel bike.
All right, there you go. Gravel bike won over the ski.
Yeah, it's more versatile. It's all season.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you, Heidi, so much. Where can everyone find you online, on socials, wherever you want them to find you?
I am building my website now, so stay tuned for that. It will be HeidiStricklerNutrition.com. But in the meantime, you can find me on Instagram, which is the primary social media platform that I'm on, and it's at HKStrickler_sportsRD.
Awesome. And do you work virtually, or do you see people in person as well, it sounds like?
My practice is virtual, so I see athletes around the country. If I have local athletes, we still do a lot of our sessions virtually just because it's convenient, but I will meet with people in person from time to time, whether it's like grocery trips or eating together or whatever it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. It was so wonderful meeting you and chatting about such important and interesting topics. And I wish you all the best.
Yeah, same. Have a good one.
All right. And that's our show for today. Thanks again, Heidi, so much for spending time with me talking about such an important topic. Give her a follow over on Instagram. She's amazing. Okay, guys, you know what I'm going to say. If you're enjoying this podcast, you want to keep these episodes coming, the biggest way you can support me is by subscribing to the show and sharing it with your friends. And of course, giving a rating and review wherever you listen if you haven't already done so. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. See you all next time.